because there seems to be an inverse relationship between how much money you have reserved to how big of an expense you're going to hit with day one. So those who are well prepared tend to not have big expenses day one. It's the people that spend every dollar on their down payment that then don't have any money set aside that get creamed with an AC that needs to get replaced on the first day they own the thing. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of The Remote Investor. My name is Michael Album, and today I'm joined by my two co-hosts,
Tom Schneider
and Pierre Carrillo.
And today we're going to be tackling a hot button issue. How much money does it actually take to get started investing in real estate remotely? All right, guys, so let's just kind of start breaking down for people listening. Everybody knows, I think, for the most part, what it takes to go invest in property or go buy property. But I think that there are some intricacies and nuances that kind of fall through the cracks and that are an unpleasant surprise when somebody is actually making their first purchase or making maybe their first remote purchase. So, Tom, would love for you to kick it off and walk us through what are the typical costs that I think are already on people's radar, or are the fairly obvious ones when it comes to remote investing?
Yeah, I guess to give like a little more structure, maybe like a good way to think about it is like first the acquisition, like, and then as a vacant home and then as an occupied home. Like, what are all those other costs that you may be aware of, but you may not be aware of? So let's start with acquisition. So for those who have gone through real estate transactions before, there are multiple ways to buy real estate. You can buy using leverage and debt, but just going through a specific transaction, thinking about all the times you're writing a check, or creating a wire. In making an offer, there's an earnest money deposit, which is I don't know, typically 20% or $5,000 or something. I don't know. So there's like
it's like 1 to 2%. I think
1 or 2%. Got it.
Could vary depending on
the market.
Yeah.
The flavor of your offer.
Yeah, exactly.
So in just the transaction, so just thinking about the times that you need to write, checks, there is the earnest money deposit that's kind of part of the offer. And then once that's accepted, within that particular transaction, there's a whole bunch of line items. The biggest one being if you are using debt, like that down payment, which is commonly, 20%, conventional. And then there's going to be a whole ton of additional line items related to title insurance, related to, all of that type
appraisals,
inspections. So yeah, I don't know. Probably be a good way to frame it is like, I don't know, like say like you're buying a $200,000 home, appraisal, I think anywhere from $500 to $1,500, Michael, would you say that's about right?
Yeah, totally reasonable.
Similarly, inspections, which will be separate and they serve very different purposes, where appraisal is kind of establishing the value for your loan, inspection, making sure the roof isn't about to cave in, and identifying any things you might want to charge back to the seller, or negotiate on. And then all those little line items related to, title insurance and some of that stuff. Michael, anything you want to riff on within that initial kind of like, oh, these are the costs to owning in that transaction phase?
No, I think that makes sense, but I think it's good to kind of wrap all those costs up. So like the inspection, the title insurance fees, all these things is what typically is referred to as closing costs. And so when someone says, oh, you're going to have your down payment plus your closing costs, what they're referring to is all of the costs and fees associated with doing the transaction. And so there's going to be a title company, there's going to be an escrow company, there's going to be the inspection, the appraisal, all these other type of things, which are going to be a requirement from your lender to have a lot of these things in place to pay a lot of these fees in order to close a deal. So I think as we're thinking about all of the closing costs, it's great to understand, okay, this is like what it means to have closing costs, and then this is what each of them are. So I love that breakdown, Tom. I think that's great. And I would also say that it's important to keep in mind that the closing costs can vary depending on geography, size of the deal, and then also the companies that you're using. So there are so many title and escrow companies out there, and they're going to have different closing costs. Same thing with lenders. There are tons of lenders out there, and they're going to have their own sets of closing costs. So just keep that in mind. It's not a one size fits all, or it's not every lender charges the same amount. And so it's important to go shop those things around to make sure that you're getting the best deal possible.
As a way to evaluate closing or I guess underwrite, what do you think of as a percentage to say all right, I'm going to spend this much on closing costs? Like, is that typically like a percentage of the purchase price, or how do you kind of if you're underwriting a deal, think about that?
No, it's a great question. I'm thinking about it using 2 to 3% of the purchase price ballpark for all of the closing costs. And so on this $200,000 property, I would say anywhere from 4 to 6 grand is gonna be totally reasonable. And that I would say is exclusive of paying points.
Mm.
And so a point for anyone who's unfamiliar is essentially you buying down the interest rate. You're paying interest in advance on the loan in order to get a better interest rate. And so a point is going to typically be 1% of the loan amount is going to translate to X percent of a reduction in interest rate. And it's not going to be 1 to 1, unfortunately. If you go by 1 point, you're not going to get 1% off your interest. You might get a quarter or a half or an eighth, depending on how the loan is priced and sized. So just keep that in mind. So I would say that 4 to 6K or that 2 to 3% of the purchase price is going to be exclusive of points. If you start paying points to get a better rate, you're going to start increasing your closing costs as a percentage of the total loan amount.
All right. Let's continue.
Is that kind of what you've seen
Yeah,
too, Tom?
yeah. I think that's spot on. I mean, I think there is some like range, and and there is some uniqueness by area on like what seller is paying for versus what the buyer is paying for. But I think that's a good sort of benchmark that 2 to 3 or 4% of the purchase price. Continuing to walk down this theme of kind of sequentially as an investor. So great, we've paid those fees, we own it, and it's vacant. Like, how would you think about now of the different costs in which you're incurring in a vacant home? Like, what are the different flavors of the ways you're spending money?
Yeah. So it's funny, as you said, when you said flavors before, I immediately thought of like top ramen noodles, like chicken flavor. I'm like, oh, I'm going to make a chicken flavored offer. And I just was, I don't know, laughing to myself. Thought it was kind of funny.
You hungry? Is it lunchtime, Michael?
It must be lunchtime. Yeah. So now that you own the property, there are some expenses. And the two biggest ones are going to be your property taxes and your insurance premiums that you're going to be paying on the property. Now, a lot of times for a new purchase, these are actually going to be wrapped into the cost of closing the deal. And if you've ever purchased a piece of property, a piece of real estate, you'll see something called prepaids on your closing statement. And this is where those expenses fall under. And so the lender or the title company is often going to require you to pay 6 or maybe even 12 months of insurance and 6 to 12 months of property taxes in advance. And so they're going to collect that from you on the front end, and then they're going to go pay that for you on your behalf. And so it's money you would have had to spend anyhow, but it usually gets collected at closing. And so if someone says, oh, well, my insurance is $1,200 a month, to make the math easy, I should expect to pay $100 a month for the first 12 months to own the property to pay the insurance. Well, you might actually be paying $1,200 day one or day zero, really. And so it's important to have those dollars set aside in advance of the purchase, knowing that that's coming. Same thing for property taxes. If you've got to pay 12 months and your property taxes are $3,000, that's another $3,000 in cash you've got to have day zero in order to close the deal, as opposed to spreading it out monthly or reserving for it monthly or paying it once a year down the road whenever property taxes are collected in your particular area. So those are two big ones that I've seen people kind of come bite people. I catch them off guard of like, that's $5,000 in this particular example, 4,500, $5,000 of extra cash you've got to have above and beyond your closing costs and your down payment. So those are kind of the two big ones that I see. Tom, what about you? How did we do?
That's good. So these are good costs that are going to happen like no matter what's happening, Another one is going to be utilities. So when you acquire a home and like lease it, oftentimes those utilities is going to be on the renter. But if the home is vacant, guess what? You're paying those utility fees. So I actually had a situation where I was a little bit of miscommunication between me and my property manager, and some of these utilities didn't get paid. And in my like credit card that does like credit monitoring, it like notified me, oh, the, DeKalb, Georgia County, whatever water, is like flagging you. And I'm like, what is going on? So that is an important thing to make sure in communicating with your PM that those fees are being paid, when it's not rented out. So utilities, water, electric, all that stuff is going to be important through the construction rehab process, as well as showing and, making the property look good. Other fees, when the home is vacant, there are different ways in which property managers can, make money off of the leasing process. Some of them just take like a month's rent once it's leased, or, some percentage, some variant of that. Others might apply some very specific marketing fee where they're paying to go do some professional photos or going to do, some like syndicating that advertisement through a bunch of different channels. So like that's another place where you might be paying on some fees as part of the lease up, like marketing related fees. And these are good questions to ask your property manager on the onset of that relationship.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think it's such a good point, Tom, too, because if a property manager charges a leasing fee and it's, call it 1 month's rent, if you buy the house and then you close on the house and then you try and let's say it's vacant, and let's say it takes 30 days to get your property manager up to speed, getting things advertised, pictures taken, that sort of a thing. By the time you start collecting rent, you could be 45 days, 2 months out, and the property manager is taking a fee to place the tenant. And so in terms of actual dollars incoming to your bank account, we could be 2 to 3 months out. And so I think it's really important that when we're thinking about the costs and the dollars in and dollars out associated with buying a new property, if it is vacant, you've got to have a couple months of mortgage payments and taxes and insurance, possibly if it wasn't prepaid in advance, but utility fees on hand, ready to pay, because you might not be collecting rent. And again, if that first month's rent is going to the property manager, so we're another 30 days out from being able to actually collect.
Not to mention, if you're Section 8, you're probably going to be even longer because it has to go through the, what is it, HUD? So
The FHA, the local housing authority.
when we got ours, we were Section 8 as well. And the rent was getting paid, but we weren't going to see it for, I think, about 4 months for it to
Yes.
get transferred over.
That's a great point. So it's just, you got to be able to weather they call them soft costs, these soft costs that are associated with just owning a property and thinking about dollars in and dollars out. Tom, how do you think about like rehab or any kind of value add if you're buying a property?
Yeah, I think, how do I think about that? A lot of those assumptions should be pretty sussed out in the underwriting. So, at the point at which you're making offer, like giving yourself a good conservative kind of range. And, there is always going to be something like you can buy like a brand new spec home and maybe there's some, warranties and stuff from the builder, but there is always going to be something. So, being conservative, ideally, your contractor is able to get an estimate before you close contingencies. So you even tighten the aperture of, what you're going to pay to get the property, move in ready.
Ooh, tighten the aperture. What a great analogy.
I might have overcooked my analogy there a little bit, but
I love
I like
it.
it. Flavors, apertures, very visual speaking guy here. But so I would, have your number in mind. Hopefully it's informed by, boots on the ground inspections, but it's going to go over. Like, I think, it's a pretty rare occurrence in that you're going under. So like having a very conservative, 25% buffer on whatever those costs are expected to be. And I think it's a good way to think about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I've done less exotic construction stuff than you have, Michael. So I'd say I'm more of like kind of a vanilla guy versus this Neapolitan in the stuff that you've done. Yeah.
Yeah, Neapolitan garbage in my experience. So one thing I just want to jump in with, because I think it's really important that folks understand, is when you go get an inspection done, these are often, whatever is addressed in the inspection is often going to be a safety issue or potentially a habitability issue or a mechanical issue. And the inspector may or may not give you an idea or ballpark cost of what it's going to cost to repair or replace whatever is identified. And so a common one is like dry rot, or the water pressure is low in the house, or there's holes in the wall. These kinds of things tend to get picked up in an inspection, and the inspector might give you a budget or they might not. But you can give that report to your property manager and hopefully they can give you an estimate to get those things repaired. Now, that being said, if all of the rooms in the house are painted bright pink and neon green, the inspector is probably not going to call that out as a line item thing that needs repair or replacement because the walls are painted. It's not a big deal. So getting your property manager to walk through the property is going to get you an idea of what it's going to cost to get the property rent ready, because those two things are very different. Physically capable of having someone living in it because it's safe to do so is very different than rent ready. And so these two numbers, the number to repair and replace any of the things caught in the inspection, and then getting your property manager to walk through and give you a number to get the property rent ready, we're going to marry these two. And that's going to be your true cost to get the property rent ready. And I will say that a lot of times in an inspection, things will show up because that's their job. You're hiring an inspector to go find issues with a home or a property. Not everything is a 911 emergency needs to be fixed now. There are some things that you might be able to wait down the road for and say, hey, you know what, that's really a B or a C tier type issue that we're going to address at the next turn. Or when I do have money to put into this property, that's not a big issue now. Versus, hey, we need to get the walls painted from this not neon green and hot pink. That is probably going to be a 911 emergency type of thing that has to happen before a tenant can move in, before pictures can be taken. And so there's dollars that we're going to earmark for CapEx down the road, for improvements down the road. And then there's dollars that we need to have set aside, like you mentioned, probably a good 25% buffer above and beyond what we want to spend day one or as soon as we own the property. So kind of two different buckets and different ways to be thinking about things, but definitely want to involve the property manager in the due diligence process and then the negotiation process of getting your inspections done and then determining an ultimate purchase price.
Great point. Yeah. I mean, yeah, spot on just how that inspector, is not looking at it, like a marketer or like a property manager would in getting the home rent ready.
And sometimes these companies who are offering the inspections do repairs themselves, and they are sending themselves business by giving you, repair line items. So yeah, just look very critically at what is going to cause more damage if you don't repair. And then, like Mike says, just kind of stagger it.
Totally. And something I do with like all of my students at MyFi Academy that we do one-on-one coaching with is we'll go through their inspection reports. If they're in escrow on a property and they're like, okay, I've never purchased a property before. How do I know what's a 911 emergency versus what's a B or a C tier? I've never seen an inspection report before, or I have, but it's only on my personal residence. So we can review all that stuff. Definitely, it's worth looping in the property manager too, because they can give you an idea of, hey, this is a problem. This is going to be a difficult thing to overcome until we get it tackled in order to get a tenant in place. Or, hey, you know what, you can probably hold off on this till down the road.
I dig it. Let's continuing on the example. So how much money do you actually need? Let's move into ownership. So like, what are you paying for once the home is occupied?
So I think the easiest one is going to be your taxes and insurance again, because after that 12-month threshold or whatever amount was collected during closing in terms of prepaids, now that's going to be an actual incurred cost that you're going to have. And I will say too, if you're escrowing funds, using your lender to essentially pay your taxes and insurance monthly with your mortgage payment, your lender can collect all that on your behalf. They'll collect the mortgage payment, they can collect the taxes, the insurance, and then they'll take care of paying those things on your behalf. I didn't used to like doing that, but now I do because it's just two less bills for me to have to worry about. And then I know the money is going to be there to pay those things as opposed to once a year or twice a year getting this big bill for those things. Technically, it's not the highest and best use of those dollars, but in terms of my mental capacity, it's a great way to go. So I really like that. But so now, assuming you're paying your taxes and insurance separately, your lender is not doing that, you're going to be paying your taxes and insurance. Those are two big expenses. You're going to have a management fee, probably some form of monthly percentage of the rent collected that the manager is going to charge you. And so while you're not technically paying it, quote unquote, the manager is taking it out of the rent they collect. So the manager is bringing in the rent, they're paying themselves a management fee. There's going to be repairs and maintenance items that are going to occur on the property. The manager is going to pay those as well on your behalf. And then whatever is left over, they're going to send to you. And then from that's where you're going to pay your mortgage, your taxes, and your insurance. Those are from what I see, kind of the typical recurring expenses that you have once you're owning the property. Tom, Pierre, what do you guys think on that?
Other types of recurring fees that might come in that may also be, quote unquote, kind of handled either in escrow by your lender or by your property manager is HOA fees. So, depending if you're buying in an area that requires you to pay. And man, I cannot advocate enough for the value of just letting somebody else do it. Like, rest in peace, First Republic Bank. I used to have like a home loan through them, and they wouldn't pay your insurance or your taxes. And it was just like, for some reason, so like annoying. It was like you put things off and you just like know you need to do it, but you just kind of wait as long as possible. It was like always that like me on paying my like local county property taxes, and there's like no reason it should be. So, um, yeah, other fee HOA is another one that can be recurring, and kind of depending on how you have utility structured, that's either the tenants paying it through the rent that they're paying to the property manager, or they're paying the utility directly. But yeah, typically, all of the costs are just going to net out of your funds collected that your property manager is for those type of costs.
Yeah. What kills me is like I see all the time people posting, "Oh, my property rents for 2,000 and my principal, interest, taxes and insurance are 1,500. So I'm making $500 a month in cash flow." It's like, I mean, yeah, technically $500 is going into your bank, but at the end of the day, like if you have a plumber that needs to go out and visit the property for a repair and they charge $100 to show up and then $100 to do the repair, that's $200. So now your cash flow is 300. And so I think we need to be earmarking, like you said, or setting aside dollars for these inevitable expenses that are going to pop up, because properties need repair and maintenance over time. It's just like a car or any piece of equipment. If we don't not maintaining it, it's going to get worse. And so I've seen people say, "Oh, I haven't had any repairs and maintenance for 6 months, 7 months, a year, whatever it is." Like, oh, well, then a big one is coming, because that's not how those things work. So you need to be maintaining things and systems in your home, which has a cost associated with it, in order to avoid catastrophic failures and catastrophic repairs down the road.
Yeah. The biggest like loss you can get into real estate is just not having enough money to cover your costs. And then you need to be like a distressed seller. So, cannot enough of making sure being really conservative on that backstop.
To that point too, is you've got insurance cost that you're paying in terms of your monthly or annual premiums. But if you have a loss, there's a deductible that you have to pay before the insurance is going to kick in. Just like if you have a medical insurance deductible, if it's $1,000, you pay that, you're on the hook for the first 1,000, and then the insurance company kicks in after the fact. Well, the same thing with when it comes to property insurance. You're going to have a deductible, $500, $1,000, $2,500, something like that are fairly common. $10,000 maybe, depending on how your insurance is structured. And so if whatever your deductible is, you need to be ready to shell that out on a moment's notice in case you do have a loss that goes above and beyond your deductible. So if you have an insured claim, a fire or a big storm damages the property, you got to shell out the first deductible amount before the insurance is going to kick in. So it's important to, while not a true expense yet, it's dollars that could be deployed at any moment and should be ready. And so when thinking about, okay, how much money do I actually need to start investing in real estate? And this is local or remote, by the way. You should have that deductible on hand as well.
All right. Where are the other places we're spending money? Might not be thinking about.
Man, so I think a big one that catches people off guard is tax prep. And so a lot of people out there are doing their own taxes and have been doing it for themselves for years. And so don't plan on changing once they start owning investment property. I'm a huge believer, anyone watching the listening to this, I'm raising my hand because I'm a huge believer, huge advocate in getting tax professionals to do your taxes for you. They tend to save you more than they cost you in terms of taxes and their fees. But at the end of the day, it's an expense. And so it happens once a year. You might be chatting with them on a semi-regular basis. They might bill you hourly. But if you're going to be investing in real estate, getting your taxes set up and done properly from day one is huge, because having to play catch up and correction on these down the road is just an absolute nightmare. So somebody might charge you $1,000, $2,000, $1,500 to do the taxes, the tax preparation for one property or two properties. And so if you're like, man, that's an entire years of cash flow, it doesn't make sense. Like, why am I investing in real estate? We want to be remembering all of the other added benefits that real estate gets us, especially on the tax side. And so I think it's just the cost of doing business, in my opinion, of getting professional tax preparer to do your taxes. That's a big one that I see catch people off guard.
Totally. And, another one would be related to maintaining LLCs. So, if you're holding title in a property there, within that type of an entity, there's going to be some annual costs that you're going to incur.
Annual, and also setup costs too. If you're going to go set up an LLC to start investing, you're probably going to want to have a lawyer do it or an attorney do it or some kind of professional help. There's going to be a cost to that. So that's your one-time cost. And then, yeah, like you said, Tom, there could be some ongoing annual maintenance fees or state filing fees or some costs associated with just owning and operating that LLC legally. or whatever entity you opt for legally. So I think it's important to be thinking about that. The nice thing is it's a tough pill to swallow, I think, at the beginning when you own one property. If you have a tax preparer charging you $1,000 and then your LLC fee in California, it's $800 a year minimum. And so between those two things combined, you're almost at $2,000. To find a property that's going to cash flow more than $2,000 a month, especially at kind of the entry level price point, is really challenging. And so you're like, crap, like I was alluding to before, what am I doing? I'm losing money on this thing, or I'm breaking even. What's the point? And I think that this really starts to become crystal clear and apparent why people do this and why it's such a lucrative investment and way to build wealth, is because those costs, that $1,800 or $2,000, is relatively fixed from a legal and preparation fee, tax preparation fee. As you start adding to the portfolio and scaling to those portfolio, the income side of the equation starts to increase while your other costs can remain fixed. And so I personally opted to not form an LLC to invest in my first 3 properties. It wasn't until I hit that 4th that I said, you know what, now there's enough cash flow coming in from the portfolio to support the $800 a year annual LLC fee, as well as support the tax preparation fee that wasn't such a big burden. It wasn't such a big cost in terms of percentage of the total income of the portfolio. So I was just opting to get umbrella insurance, which is another cost you might want to think about in terms of asset protection and investing in general, is getting an umbrella, which kind of falls under the insurance category. But so that was kind of a personal decision that I made. And I said, okay, yes, now this makes sense. There's enough cash flow coming in to support these extra expenses. That was my rant. I will get off my soapbox.
Yeah, and then protecting your assets beyond your lifetime, you might want to put this into a trust. Put your LLC into a trust so that you can facilitate passing it on to the next generation. So,
yep, that's great. And I think that the nice thing too, that's a one-time expense that you're going to incur when you buy the property, when you set the trust up. And it's not something you have to do. Like, these are just, I think the point of this episode, which I think we've done a great job of, semi-biased, is just talking about all of the fees that someone could expect to incur when investing in property. Because there's too many people out there that says, yep, 20% down, you're good to go. It's just not the case. It's not reality. And so these are all these expenses you could expect to incur. Some of them optional, some of them mandatory. But I want to make sure we're giving everybody the full breadth with as much information as possible.
So let's bring it back full circle, Mike. If we are looking at a $200,000 property, we're going to buy it with conventional financing. How much money should we have?
Yeah, it's a great question, man. So minimum are 20% down, right? That's our scratch bottom number, bottom of the barrel number. Then we're going to have our closing costs, so 2 to 3% on top of that. So 20% of 200 grand is 40 grand in cash. We'll call it 5 grand. We'll split the difference in closing costs. So now we're at 45. We're going to be paying 12 months of insurance and taxes. Let's use a round number, call it 4 grand for those two things. So now we're at 49. Then we're going to have some reserves that we need in case of the property not getting rented, some CapEx potentially. We'll call that another 5 grand. So now we're at 54. Now we're going to have some money set aside for because I'm the insurance guy. I want to put it in a trust. I want to have it in an LLC, and I want to have a proper tax professional doing my tax return. So while the LLC fee I'm going to accrue up front, call it $1 grand. So now we're at 55. And then I want some money in the bank just to make me feel good in case anything does go sideways. On a $200,000 property, let's say for the sake of discussion that the inspection was clean and fairly good. It was already a rental, so there's not a whole lot of painting I have to do. I'm going to put another 5 grand into the mix so I can sleep good at night. And Murphy's Law, Mr. Murphy doesn't show up because there seems to be an inverse relationship between how much money you have reserved to how big of an expense you're going to hit with day one. So those who are well prepared tend to not have big expenses day one. It's the people that spend every dollar on their down payment that then don't have any money set aside that get creamed with an AC that needs to get replaced on the first day they own the thing. So if I add another 5 grand on top of that, I think that puts us at 60 grand all in for a $200,000 house.
What's kind of fun about this discussion is we opened up talking about permitting and not getting permitting.
Yeah.
And, within investing, there's a lot of ways to be successful and a lot of philosophical approaches. And throughout all of these different, points that we're talking about, costs to incur and things to do, there is like bands of like what's your risk tolerance, like what's your block, So, two investors can be looking at the same house and come up with a
Yes.
lot of different assumptions, come up with a lot of different things that are required for them to move forward, like, oh, putting it in LLC, doing and it's like, there isn't necessarily one that's like right. There's one that's maybe a little bit more conservative. But I think it was like interesting about this episode, and probably like a lot of just general discussions about real estate, is there are like many different ways to look at it and approach, depending on risk tolerance, general philosophy, all of that. So I don't know, just kind of like an interesting point, like in taking from our very early discussion about like, permitting risk through going through all of these assumptions.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's such a good point, Tom. It's such a good point. And I think there might be people listening that's like, oh, that's way too conservative for me. I never use LLCs, or I do my own taxes in half for forever. And I would only buy turnkey. So that $5,000 is, additional savings. So we can take $7,000 right off the top.
Or better, like the reason like not to be so conservative is I want to deploy more capital. Like I don't want to save like a year's worth of whatever. Like what I could use that to buy another house, like, and really get like the flywheel going. So
Right.
There, you can make arguments on either side.
Absolutely. And easily winnable arguments too. I think that they both, there's two sides of that coin, make sense for those different types of investors out there. I think what everybody takes away from this episode is what are the things that can happen. And so go into that eyes wide open when making your decision about how you identify and quantify risk for you as an investor. Because that's the biggest thing here, is we want to give people the information to then go make an informed decision.
Yeah, I would ask the audience, how much would you feel comfortable setting aside for a $200,000 property? Are Mike's numbers crazy?
Yeah. Please share with us in the
Let
comments.
us know in the comments,
love to hear from everybody. Love to hear from everybody. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, guys. This was a lot of fun. Appreciate everybody hanging in there with us who made it to the end. Hope it was valuable. We'd love to hear from you. Leave us a comment, rating, review, and we will catch you on the next episode. In the meantime, happy investing.
Happy investing.